Free the radio population. Quality and doom, the 1-2 combination. Let's go.
About time you heard a rhyme flow with Doom and Quali to catch you with the combo. Boop, boop. Muhammad Ali versus Potsy, Kirshen Yahtzee at the crap table. Bursting caps at a Nazi rap label. Oops, a pot of hot tea spilt on the cable. Evaporate ice grill, read the seeds of Aesop fable. Children, come sit, gather, face the rapid fire. The super slap shit out of liar. D-Head, villain, a champ, tramp. Flowing since they had him. Cleaned his mask with a shoe mitt and a little bit of her blue spit. She told him, you so stupid. Wiped it off, got dressed and left.
Everybody instigating, not just the rest. We can shoot the five on the dirt ground. Rocks out live with the worst sound. First round, knockout.
Radio population, quality and doom, the 1-2 combination. Let's go.
All right. Very nice.
Meanwhile, in a control room at the back of the theater,
Those brats won. I knew they would.
All right. So, what are we doing today? We are going to continue from where we left off. Hello, everyone. There we go. And let me just go ahead and check where we stopped last time real quick. Doodly deep deep. Yes, at Cambodia. We stopped at Cambodia. Hello, I am Cambodia. All right. Important. Mic check. Actually, let me see how I sound real quick. Important. Mic check. Actually, let me see how I sound real quick. I feel like I want to cut off some high end or something off the microphone. Let me put a filter on it. Reband EQ. Test that a little bit better. I feel like I want to cut off noise suppression. This gate. I think we're good. Awesome. Important changes have occurred in Cambodia since 1988, including Vietnam's withdrawal from that country, elections held under UN auspices, and the death of Pol Pot. We noted in Chapter 7 that after the Vietnamese had ousted Pol Pot in December 1978, although the United States and its allies had denounced Pol Pot as another Hitler committing genocide, they quickly became his supporter, allowing him to retain Cambodia's UN seat and otherwise aiding and protecting him in his Thailand refuge. Vietnam was severely punished by harsh sanctions and by U.S. support for a Chinese invasion to teach Vietnam a lesson for having terminated Pol Pot's atrocities. President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, stated in 1979 that I encouraged the Chinese to support Pol Pot. I encouraged the Thai to help DK, Democratic Kampuchea, Pol Pot's forces. Pol Pot was an abomination. We could never support him, but China could. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Vietnamese sought to end their isolation by exiting from Cambodia, but insisted as a condition for withdrawal that Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge be excluded from returning to power, the United States objected and insisted, with eventual success, that the Khmer Rouge be included as a contestant party in the post-occupation settlement. What dominated U.S. policy and led to its support of Pol Pot was the classic rule that the enemy of my enemy, Vietnam, is my friend, and perhaps also the new tilt towards China, also hostile towards Vietnam. The support of Pol Pot was awkward, given the prior denunciations of his policies, but the mainstream media handled it with aplomb, and the U.S. public was almost surely completely unaware that the United States had become his ally and supporter. The explicit statement of support by Brzezinski, quoted above, was never mentioned in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or Newsweek. It was quoted once in both the Los Angeles Times and Time. However, in the late 1990s, after Vietnam had left Cambodia and U.S. officials' anti-Vietnam passions had subsided, and Pol Pot was no longer a useful instrument of anti-Vietnam policy, U.S. officials and pundits rediscovered Pol Pot's and the Khmer Rouge's villainy and candidacy for war crimes trials. The media handled the previous tilt towards Pol Pot mainly by evasion, essentially blacking out the years 1979 to 95, or vaguely intimating that the U.S. had supported him for reasons of realpolitik, but avoiding both details on the nature and magnitude of support, as well as any reflections on the morality of backing another Hitler. The New York Times summary of Pol Pot's rise and fall, April 17, 1998, lists for 1979 to 1990, Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge are given refuge at Thai border, where they fight back against the Vietnamese. Given refuge is misleading. They were given economic and military aid and political support by the United States and its allies. The Times' main reporter on Cambodia in early 1998, Seth Medans, repeatedly blacked out mention of U.S. support, referring to the decade-long civil war that followed Pol Pot's ouster and a 19-year guerrilla insurgency in the jungles of western and northern Cambodia. Pol Pot's ouster and a 19-year guerrilla insurgency in the jungles of western and northern Cambodia. The Boston Globe, New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, editorializing on the death of Pol Pot on April 17, 1998, were uniformly indignant over his crimes and regretful at his escape from justice, but all avoided mentioning the long U.S. support of the criminal, as well as the U.S. contribution to the first phase of a decade of genocide. The Washington Post blacked out the inconvenient 15-year period of support of Pol Pot with this summary. After the nightmare of Khmer Rouge rule and genocide, the United States and its allies pumped millions of dollars into Cambodia to help rebuild and to hold elections. It is enlightening to compare the media's treatment of Pol Pot and Indonesian leader Suharto, who was also in the news in 1998, as Indonesia suffered a financial crisis that, along with popular resistance to the dictatorship, eventually led to his ouster. Pol Pot was described in the editorials and news columns of April 1998 as crazed, a killer, war criminal, mass murderer, blood-soaked, and as having engineered a reign of terror and genocide. But in 1998 and 1999, and in earlier years as well, While Suharto was occasionally referred to as dictator and running an authoritarian regime, he was never a killer or mass murderer or one responsible for genocide. The terminological double standard is maintained reliably throughout the mainstream media. Less obvious but equally interesting is the difference in willingness to identify the responsible parties for the killings of Pol Pot and Suharto. In the case of Pol Pot, there is no uncertainty or complexity. Editorials and news articles uniformly make him and the Khmer Rouge leadership clearly and unambiguously responsible for all deaths in Cambodia during the period 1975 to 78. He was the man who slaughtered 2 million, the executioner who presided over the deaths of his victims, and the man who drove Cambodia to ruin. But in Suharto's case, we move to an ambiguous responsibility, which means none at all. In the New York Times, for example, a 1965 coup led to the massacres of hundreds of thousands of supposed communists. Editorial, August 23, 1996, where we have no agent doing the killing or a wave of violence that took up to 500,000 lives and led Suharto to seize power from Sukarno in a military coup. Seth Medan's August 7, 1996, where the massacre not only has no agent, but is falsely situated before the takeover of power by Suharto. In a later piece, Medan states that more than 500,000 Indonesians are estimated to have died in a purge of leftists in 1965, the year Mr. Suharto came to power, April 8, 1997. Note the passive voice, never used in collection with Pol Pot, the word purge instead of slaughter or massacre, and the continued failure to identify the agent. In the case of East Timor, also the Times is uncertain about the source of the killing. This is one of the world's sadder places, where 100,000 to 200,000 people died from 1974 in a brutal civil war, and the consequent invasion through combat, execution, disease, and starvation. Stephen Erlanger, October 21, 1990. In addition to the lack of a clear agent, this sentence seriously misrepresents the facts. The Civil War was short and left small numbers dead, and the invasion was not consequent to a brutal civil war, except in Indonesian propaganda. Another important difference in the treatment of the worthy victims of Pol Pot and the unworthy victims of Suharto is in the willingness to explain away the killings. Pol Pot, as we describe in Chapter 7, the background of the first phase of the genocide was completely blacked out in the mainstream account. There is no qualification to Pol Pot's responsibility as a killer because his forces had undergone terrible damage and sought vengeance for the crimes they had suffered, nor are there any deaths in Pol Pot's years of rule to be explained by the starvation and disease already pervasive in April 1975. No, the only mentionable background is his Paris training and communist fanaticism. But with Suharto, we encounter a whole new world of contextualized apologetics. For many years, the main protective formula was that the 1965 to 66 killings were a result of a failed coup, which touched off a wave of violence or followed an onslaught from the left. This formula, invoked repeatedly, suggests that the mass killings are provoked and thus may be justified by a prior onslaught. The writers never explain why a failed coup could possibly justify a large-scale slaughter, but the hint is left hanging. In more recent years, usually in connection with the explanation and rationalization of the continuation of a dictatorship, the media regularly juxtaposed political repression with stability and growth. The signs of his success are everywhere, although Suharto has brought these gains by maintaining a tight grip on power and suppressing public criticism and political opposition. These statements from the New York Times offer a kind of context that the paper never gives to Castro, let alone a Pol Pot, and it shows an apologetic that runs deep. This apologetic extends to the Suharto invasion and occupation of East Timor. For years, the New York Times reporters have claimed that Indonesia invaded in the midst of a civil war, when in fact that civil war was over well before the invasion. The paper's news coverage of East Timor actually fell to zero as the Indonesian attacks and killings in East Timor reached a deadly peak in 1977 to 78, a slaughter that elsewhere would be called genocidal. And although Indonesia occupied East Timor in violation of standing UN rulings of standing UN rulings till its induced exit in 1999, the paper's reporters repeatedly refer to East Timor as a disputed province and East Timorese resistance as separatist, thereby internalizing and explicitly legitimizing the aggression and occupation. The bias and gentle treatment of Suharto and the Indonesian government in the media is once again correlated with U.S. policy support that dates back to the military coup and slaughters of 1965. These were greeted with enthusiasm by U.S. officials. Then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara referred to the events as one of the dividends of U.S. support for the Indonesian military, and the boiling bloodbath and staggering mass slaughter were also seen in the media as a gleam of light. Games rested in the New York Times. Oh, god damn it, I was muted. Um, I was saying that Suharto and Pol Pot may have killed the same number of people, but the U.S. media was discussing Suharto favorably and Pol Pot not at all. New York Times reporter David Sanger differentiated Suharto and post-1990 Saddam Hussein. Before 1990, he was a U.S. ally, saying Mr. Suharto is not hoarding anthrax or threatening to invade Australia. Ooh, that is Suharto's invasion, mass killing, and long illegal occupation of East Timor is given zero weight, and his slaughter of somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people within Indonesia in some years back is also not mentioned. This tells us all we need to know about how good and bad genocide is fair in the Western propaganda system. Further applications. In his book, Golden Rule, political scientist Thomas Ferguson argues that where the major investors in political parties and elections agree on an issue, the parties will not compete on that issue, no matter how strongly the public might want an alternative. He contends that for ordinary voters to influence electoral choices, they would have to have strong channels that directly facilitate mass deliberation and expression. These would include unions and other intermediate organizations that might, through their collective power, cause the interests of ordinary voters to be given greater weight in the political system. The propaganda model and the institutional arrangements that it reflects suggests that the same forces that preclude competition among the parties on issues on which the major investors agree will also dominate media choices and rule out mass deliberation and expression on those issues. For example, polls regularly indicate, except in periods of war and intense war propaganda, the public wants a smaller defense budget and favors a spending shift from defense to education and other civil functions. But because the major investors agree that a large defense budget is desirable, the two dominant parties compete only on whether the one or the other is spending, one or the other is skimping on military expenditures, with both promising to enlarge it, as both George W. Bush and Al Gore did in the presidential election campaign of 2000. And the mainstream media do the same, limiting debate to the terms defined by the two parties and excluding deliberation and expression of the position that large cuts are desirable. The alternative presidential candidate, Ralph Nader, called for such cuts, but the media denied him a voice on the issues, some of them explicitly defending his exclusion from the presidential debates on the grounds that the options afforded by the two parties sufficed. Oh, I didn't know that, Ralph Nader. Well, they only had two debate contestants. They only had two performers in the debates back in the day. The U.S. corporate The alternative presidential candidate, Ralph Nader, called for such cuts, but the media denied him. The U.S. corporate community has favored an immense defense budget, currently more than 5 times the size of that of a steadily weakening Russia, the second biggest spender, because of the great benefits its members derive from military spending. These include weapons and other contracting business, direct and indirect subsidies and research, and the role played by military power in supporting the global economic expansion, in which many U.S. transnational corporations are active participants and beneficiaries. Business also benefits from the market opening actions of trade agreements and from the supportive operations of the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF. But these trade agreements and the activities of the international financial institutions have generated controversy and a political struggle, because while their benefits to business are clear, their costs are borne heavily by workers forced to compete in a global job market. Furthermore, the globalization and trade agreements strengthen the political as well as economic power of the corporate community, in part because they shift decision-making authority from democratic policies to democratic politics to bankers and technocrats who more reliably serve the transnational corporate interests. Here also, as in the case of defense versus civilian-oriented budgets, polls show a sharp dichotomy between corporate and public preferences, with the latter generally hostile to the agreements and institutional arrangements favored by business. The propaganda model fits well the media's treatment of the range of issues. Consider, for example, their coverage of the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the subsequent Mexican financial crisis and meltdown of 1994 to 1995. Polls taken before its enactment consistently showed substantial majorities opposed to NAFTA and later to the bailout of investors in Mexican securities, but the elite in favor. Media editorials, news coverage, and selection of experts in opinion columns were heavily skewed towards the elite preference. Their judgment was that the benefits of NAFTA were obvious, were agreed to by all qualified authorities, and that only demagogues and special interests were opposed. The special interests who might be the losers included women, minorities, and a majority of the workforce. The media dealt with the awkward fact that POTUS showed steady majority opposition to the agreement mainly by ignoring it, but occasionally they suggested that the public was uninformed and didn't recognize its own true interests. The effort of labor to influence the outcome of the NAFTA debates was sharply attacked in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, with no comparable criticism of corporate or governmental lobbying or propaganda. And while labor was attacked for its alleged position on these issues, the press refused to allow the actual position to be expressed. In December 1994, only 11 months after NAFTA went into effect, Mexico suffered a major financial crisis, including a massive flight of capital, a devaluation of the currency, and a subsequent bailout by the IMF that required Mexico to carry out painful deflationary measures. Despite the fact that the meltdown occurred within a year of the introduction of NAFTA, which the media had portrayed as ushering in a prospective golden age of economic advance, they were unanimous that NAFTA was not to blame. And in virtual lockstep, they supported the Mexican investor bailout, despite poll reports of general public opposition in the United States. Experts and media pundits and editorialists repeatedly explained that one great merit of NAFTA was that it had locked Mexico in so that it couldn't alter its overall policy direction or resort to controls to protect itself from severe deflation and unemployment. They were oblivious to the profoundly undemocratic nature of this lock-in, made more questionable by the fact that it had been negotiated by a Mexican government that ruled as a result of electoral fraud. More recently, when the growing global opposition to the policies of the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank led to the mass protests at the WTO conference in Seattle in November and December 1999, and then at the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. in April 2000, media coverage of these events was derisive and hostile to the protesters, and almost uniformly failed to deal with the substantive issues that drove the protests. The media portrayed the Seattle protesters as all-purpose agitators, U.S. News and World Report, terminally aggrieved, Philadelphia Inquirer, simply against world trade, ABC News, and making much ado about nothing, CNN. But the bases of the protesters' grievances were almost entirely unexplored. Similarly, in the cases of the Washington, D.C. protests, the media repeatedly reported on activists' attire, looks, body odors, faddism, and claimed a lack of anything that coherently be called a cause. Fashion? Michael Kelly, journalist, Washington Post, and they continued their refusal to address issues. There were many informed protesters with coherent agendas at Seattle and Washington, including reputable economists, social theorists, and veteran organizers from around the world. But the media did not seek them out, preferring to stereotype anti-globalization activists as ignorant troublemakers. On op-ed pages, there was a major imbalance hostile to the protesters. TV bias was at least as great and often misleading on the facts. In his November 29, 1999 backgrounder on the WTO, Dan Rather explained that the organization had ruled on many environmental issues, implying that those rulings were protective of the environment, when in fact they generally privileged trade rights over environmental needs. Another notable feature of media reporting on both Seattle and Washington, D.C. protests, and a throwback to their biased treatment of the protests of the Vietnam War era, 1965 to 75, was their exaggeration of protester violence, their downplaying of police provocations and violence. Oops, let me zoom in a little bit. Why is this like this? How do I? There we go. Okay, that's a little better. They're downplaying police provocations and violence and their compliance at illegal police tactics designed to limit all protester actions, peaceable or otherwise. Although Seattle police resorted to force and used chemical agents against many nonviolent protesters well before a handful of individuals began breaking windows, both then and later the media reversed this chronology, stating that the police violence was a response to protester violence. In fact, the vandals were largely ignored by the police, while peaceful protesters were targeted for beatings, tear gas, torture with pepper spray, and arrest. One New York Times article went so far as to claim that the Seattle protesters had thrown excrement, rocks, and Molotov cocktails at delegates and police officers. The Times later issued a correction acknowledging that these claims were false. Dan Rather, who had falsely alleged that the protesters had brought on today's crackdown at Seattle, later suggested that the Washington protesters were possibly hoping for a replay of last year's violence in Seattle, setting this off against those charged with keeping the peace who have other ideas. In their 87-page report, Out of Control, Seattle's flawed response to protests against the World Trade Organization, the American Civil Liberties Union stated that the demonstrators in Seattle were overwhelmingly peaceful. Not so the police. The response of the Seattle police to the protest was characterized by draconian violations of civil liberties, including widespread use of chemical weapons, rubber bullets, and clubs against peaceful protesters and bystanders alike. But NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, and the New York Times and Washington Post all ignored the release of the ACLU's findings, which ran counter to their own uniformly pro-police and anti-protester line. The media's reversal of chronology and inflation of the threat of activist violence and their low-key treatment of numerous illegal police actions designed to instill fear in those wanting to protest peaceably all provide the enabling ground for both police violence and serious restrictions on free speech. These increased in scope and sophistication between Seattle and Washington, and were then applied to squelch protest at the Republican and Democratic conventions in Philadelphia and Los Angeles in July and August 2000. The corporate media's hostility to the goals of the protests, closely aligned with that of the rest of the corporate establishment, caused their devotion to the First Amendment to flag in a way it never has when their own rights and privileges have been at stake. As is suggested by the media's treatment of NAFTA and of labor's right to participate in its debates, as well as the media coverage of Watergate, COINTELPRO, and other major events in the earlier history of labor management conflict, the Haymarket Affair, the Homestead Strike, the post-World War I Red Scare. The propaganda model applies to domestic as well as foreign policy issues. Labor has been under renewed siege in the United States for the past several decades, its condition adversely affected by the deflationary policies of the early 1980s, corporate downsizing, globalization, a vigorous business campaign to defeat unions, and government support of, or indifference to, the damage being inflicted on unions and workers. There was a major drop in union membership from the beginning of the Reagan era, with union density falling from 25% in 1980 to just 4 to 5% in 1996, and only 2% in the private sector. This reflected weakened labor bargaining power and was accompanied by significant concessions in wages and benefits, more onerous working conditions, and greater worker insecurity. President Reagan's firing of 1,000 striking air controllers in 1981 put the government seal of approval on strike breaking, and a new era of industrial relations opened. You would hardly know this from reading or listening to mainstream media. An exceptional 1994 Business Week article noted that over the past dozen years, U.S. industry has conducted one of the most successful union wars ever, helped by illegally firing thousands of workers for exercising their right to organize, with unlawful firings occurring in 1/3 of all representation elections in the late 80s. But this successful war was carried out quietly, with media cooperation. The decertification of unions, use of replacement workers, and long debilitating strikes like that involving Caterpillar were treated in a very low-key manner. In a notable illustration of the applicability of the propaganda model, the 9-month-long Pittston miners' strike that began in April 1989 was accorded much less attention and less friendly treatment than the Soviet miners' strikes of the summer of that same year. From 1977 through 1999, while the incomes of the top 1% of households grew by 84.8% and the top 10% by 44.6%, the bottom 60% lost ground, and the income of the lowest 20% fell by 12.5%. Real hourly earnings of production and non supervisory employees, i.e., the 80% of the workforce that holds working class jobs, fell by 4.8% between 1973 and 1999. So, wow. Yep. We just keep falling and they just keep gaining more. This, along with the adverse trend of social indicators in the same period, suggests that the welfare of the majority declined in this era of high employment, a new economy, and a spectacular upswing in the stock market. In its euphoria phase, which ended abruptly with the collapse of the dot-com market in 1999 and 2000, the mainstream media hardly noticed that only a minority had been the beneficiaries. They briefly discovered this issue only under the impetus of Pat Buchanan's right-wing populist outcries during the 1996 presidential campaign. In the 2000 electoral campaign, once again the two major party candidates said nothing about the failure of the majority to be lifted in the supposed rising tide that would benefit everybody. Only Ralph Nader and other marginalized candidates did, and as noted, the dominant media found that the agenda of the major parties was all that they could ask for. Another striking application of the propaganda model can be seen in the media's treatment of the chemical industry and its regulation. Because of the industry's power, as well as the media's receptivity to the demands of the business community, the media have normalized a system described by Rachel Carson in Silent Spring as deliberately poisoning us, then policing the results. Ooh, Silent Spring. That's a good one to read. Industry is permitted to produce and sell chemicals, and during the 1990s, bioengineered foods, without independent and prior proof of safety, and the policing by the Environmental Protection Agency has been badly compromised by underfunding and political limits on both law enforcement and testing. Now, a major National Research Council study of 1984 found that there was no health hazard data available for 78% of the chemicals in commerce, and an Environmental Defense Fund update found little change had occurred a dozen years later. The federal government's National Toxicology Program tests about 10 to 20 chemicals a year for carcinogenity, but not for the numerous other possible adverse effects of chemicals. But meanwhile, 500 to 1,000 new chemicals enter commerce annually, so our knowledge base steadily declines. The system works well for industry, however, as it wants to sell without interference and leaving virtually all of the research and testing for safety in its hands, with its members to decide when the results are worthy of transmission to the EPA, is a classic fox guarding the chickens arrangement. The system has worked poorly for the public, and its inadequacy has been reinforced by the industry's power to influence, sometimes even capture, the EPA. Nevertheless, the industry often contends that the safety of chemicals is assured by EPA or FDA regulation, which industry does its best to keep weak, and which, as noted, has failed to deal in any way with the great majority of chemicals in the market. With the media's help, the chemical industry has gained wide acceptance of its view that chemicals should be evaluated individually on the basis of an analysis of their risks to individuals and individual tolerances. It is very hard to measure such risk and tolerance for humans. Controlled experiments are not possible. Damage may show up only after many years. The forms of damage are hard to know in advance. Chemicals may interact with others in the environment. They may be bioaccumulative, and the breakdown of products of chemicals may have their own dangers. Furthermore, if thousands of chemicals enter the environment, many long-lasting, bioaccumulative, and interacting with other chemicals, a public policy that ignores their additive and interactive effects on people and the environment is deeply flawed and irresponsible. Policy based on the precautionary principle, bitterly opposed by the chemical industry with the support of the U.S. government, would not allow chemicals to enter the environment without full testing, would prohibit the use of chemicals that accumulate in human tissues and whose breakdown products are threatening or unknown, and would compel the use of non-threatening alternatives for untested and known to be risky chemicals, where such alternatives can be found or developed at reasonable costs. In successfully avoiding application of the precautionary principle, Industry spokespersons have argued that the existing system is based on sound science. But science does not tell us that the industry has any right to put chemicals into the environment that have any risk at all, let alone tell us what risks are acceptable. These are political decisions. Furthermore, if the chemicals in the environment have not been tested for all the variables that are relevant to social choices, such as their long-term effects on immune system and reproduction, as well as any cancer threat, and the effects of their breakdown products on the environment, and none of them have been so tested, the political, not scientific basis of sound science is evident. The chemical industry has produced and long denied any harm from innumerable products, from tetraethyl lead in gasoline and PCBs in batteries to asbestos, DDT, and Agent Orange, that are now well established as seriously harmful, only withdrawing them, often only from domestic use, under overwhelming legal and regulatory pressure. For the products they have wanted to sell, they have always found scientists who would testify to their harmlessness, or that claims of harm were not scientifically proven. There's been a consistent, sharp difference between the results of industry-sponsored science and those of independent researchers working the same terrain. And there have been numerous cases of fraud in industry testing, industry's use of testing labs that arrange the data to find industry products acceptable, and political manipulation to weaken regulatory standards. Despite these industry abuses of science, the media have largely accepted the industry's claim that it supports sound science, in contrast with its critics' use of junk science. From 1996 through September 1998, 258 articles in mainstream newspapers used the phrase junk science, but only 21 or 8% use it to refer to corporate abuses of science, whereas 160 or 62% applied it to science used by environmentalists, other corporate critics, or tort lawyers suing corporations. 77 or 30% didn't fit either of these categories. In short, the media have internalized industry's self-legitimizing usage, just as they have normalized the status quo of caveat emptor, buyer beware, rather than of safety first. The media have also regularly got, that's good. Buyer beware versus safety first. That's a good one. The media have also regularly gotten on board in dismissing concerns about chemical threats as unwarranted scares, such as the alleged scares over dioxin and the danger of ulcer something on apples. But these and other scares often turned out to be based on genuine health hazards. Meanwhile, the media rarely report and examine in any depth the frequent evidence of the inadequacy of regulation and testing and of the real cost of chemicalization of the environment. For example, the International Joint Commission, IJC, and Joint Canadian-U.S. venture, dating back to 1978, was given the formal task of trying to halt the flow of toxic chemicals into the Great Lakes. It reports each year that it is failing, and since 1992 has called for the ending of the manufacture of chlorine as essential to fulfilling its task. The national media virtually ignore this appeal, and the IJC's U.S. co-chair Gordon Durnell has remarked that we have a societal problem about how to deal with this, but 90% of the population doesn't even know there is anything to worry about. We believe that the propaganda model helps understand this lack of knowledge. In the health insurance controversy of 1992 to 1993, the media's refusal to take the single-payer option seriously, despite apparent widespread public support and the effectiveness of the system in Canada, served well the interest of the insurance and medical service complex. The uncritical media, reporting and commentary on the alleged urgency of fiscal restraint and a balanced budget in the years 1992 to 1996, fit well the business community's desire to reduce the social budget and weaken regulation. The media's gullibility in accepting the claim of a social security system crisis, which would require policy action at some 37 years ahead if certain conservative guesses were true and a number of easy corrections were ruled out, served the interests of conservative ideologues anxious to weaken a highly successful government program and a social security industry eager to benefit from the partial or full privatization of Social Security. The applicability of the propaganda model in these and other cases, including the media's handling of the drug wars, seems clear. Concluding note: the propaganda model remains a useful framework for analyzing and understanding the workings of the mainstream media, perhaps even more so than in 1988. As we noted above, the changes in the structural conditions that underlie the model, and that we believe strongly and often decisively influence media behavior and performance, have tended to increase the model's salience. We noted in the preface to the first edition and in chapters 2 and 3, in reference to the media's coverage of the wars and elections in Central America in the 1980s, that the media's performance often surpassed expectations of media subservience to government propaganda demands. This was at least equally true of their performance in covering the 1999-1991 war against Iraq and NATO's war against Yugoslavia in 1999, as we have described earlier and briefly in regard to Yugoslavia and in detail elsewhere. In our conclusion to the first edition, we emphasize that as the negative performance effects of the media result primarily from their structure and objectives, real change in performance calls for substantial changes in underlying media organization and goals. In the years since 1988, structural changes have not been favorable to improved performance, but it remains a central truth that democratic politics require a democratization of information sources and a more democratic media. Along with trying to contain and reverse the growing centralization of the mainstream media, grassroots movements and intermediate groups that represent large numbers of ordinary citizens should put much more energy and money into creating and supporting their own media, as they did with the independent media centers brought into existence during the Seattle and Washington, D.C. protests of 1999 and 2000. These and other nonprofit community-based broadcasting stations and networks, and a better use of public access channels, the internet, and independent print media will be essential for the achievement of major democratic social and political successes. Notes to introduction. Okay, and then all these notes. Wow. Damn. So what does that give you? 53 pages of introduction? Wow. Crazy. 50. Yeah, so basically, I mean, not basically, it's pretty complex, but the media serves the interests of capital. I mean, you know, that's capitalism, but they pretend to be impartial, but then they coordinate their messaging to align with the government, basically. And yeah, it goes whichever way the same actions, you know, if they are committed by someone who's an ally versus someone who's an enemy, are reported completely differently. And yeah, that's the introduction. Use the propaganda model to explain that. So I guess we'll find out more, but that will be it for the introduction and for tonight. This has been the Midnight Chomsky. I've been Michael Shemesh, the house gecko. I am a gecko who plays house music. Holy crap, there's a preface now? What was that? Introduction and a preface? What's the difference? Okay, anyway. Good night, everybody. I love you all. And yeah, we're going to get through this.
High Mason, you bet your life, baby. That's right, I'm down here with the world's most popular drinking areas, you understand? The South. Yeah, where everything is nice, and they do it right. And everybody here is waiting for the $1 million jackpot number to come up, man. And you know, there's a lot of sincere confusion about just what the doctor said.
To the head, the new June moon soon on a blue lagoon shoes, doom zooms in on a platoon.
Too much to do.
Sniper relief, swipe him off the street.